So, I don't know if you guys know this, but I love The Legend of Zelda. Shocking, I know. Zelda has been one of those series that has had a surprisingly strong grip on me ever since I picked up Majora's Mask 3D over a decade ago at this point. From its timeless stories, fantastic worlds, and memorable characters, it's easily cemented itself as one of, if not my favorite game series of all time. However, there's one other thing that makes Zelda games special. You know them, you love them, dungeons. The series has no shortage of fantastic dungeons, with each one being unique and memorable in its own way. It could be the atmosphere, the puzzles, the boss, or the fact that it makes me want to commit several war crimes. Now it goes without saying that there are a lot of Zelda dungeons. Like, a lot. If I were to rank every dungeon in the series, we'd be here for at least 2 to 3 hours, and frankly, that just sounds miserable. So instead, I'm gonna be kind to both myself and you all and only rank the dungeons in the 3D games today. This means that we'll only be looking at the dungeons from Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom. Each of the dungeons will fall into a tier, with D tier being the lowest and S tier being the highest. I'll also only be ranking the main dungeons for this list, the ones with a boss at the end where Link either obtains a heart container or beats the game. So this would mean that locations like Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle would count, while the bottom of the well from Ocarina wouldn't. I'm also mostly going on the dungeon itself rather than the boss or item. This means that the dungeon can rank higher on the list even if it has a terrible boss. Looking at you, Tantalus. However, there will probably be some times where I can't help but factor the boss or item into the equation, and it's my list, so I can do whatever the hell I want, so suck it, losers. And all of this goes without saying, but every dungeon placement is my personal opinion. I may really like a dungeon that some of you absolutely despise, and vice versa. So if you don't like that, then I don't care. And if it wasn't obvious, this video took a lot of time and effort to make, so it would mean the world to me if you left a like and subscribed so this video doesn't go to waste. And who knows, if this video does well, then maybe I'll rank all of the 2D Zelda dungeons next. Actually, that's a terrible idea, never mind, please don't make me do that. So with that out of the way, let's get started with the dungeons of Ocarina of Time. Oh yeah, and enjoy these random transitions.
Fuck you, nature.
The inside of the Deku Tree is probably one of the most important dungeons in Ocarina of Time. Its main goal is to serve as a tutorial for the player, introducing them to some of the various puzzle-solving mechanics they'll use throughout the game, such as using Deku Sticks to light torches and pushing blocks onto switches. However, it's also important in the sense that it's the first 3D dungeon in the series. It needed to show the player how dungeons would work in this style, and to that extent, I think it works pretty well. Nothing is too challenging, but it doesn't hold your hand either. It's a good dungeon, but that's really about it. As far as dungeons go, you can definitely tell that this was the first dungeon. It's very standard and safe, if that makes sense. It's not bad, but compared to later dungeons, it's not entirely memorable. So, B tier.
Bombs? You want it? It's yours, my friend.
Dodongo's Cavern is the next dungeon on our list, and it steps things up slightly. The dungeon as a whole is a lot less linear than the previous one, but that still doesn't mean it's difficult to navigate. It's also a lot more combat focused than the Great Deku Tree was, giving us our first proper mini-boss fight in the form of some Lizalfos. And, yeah, I'm gonna be so real here, guys, I don't remember much about this dungeon. Like, it's kind of forgettable. Getting the bombs is kind of fun, but other than that, yeah, I've got nothing. D tier.
You know what that means? Fish!
Okay, so Jabu Jabu's belly is a double-edged sword. On one hand, this dungeon is super cool from a design standpoint. I love how narrow and claustrophobic the hallways are, how all the enemies are like parasites inside the fish's body, and how just gross the whole thing is. Aesthetically speaking, this dungeon is great. That being said, the whole thing is super confusing in my opinion. Whenever I play Ocarina of Time, I always dread this dungeon purely because I know that I'm going to spend at least an hour walking back and forth trying to figure out what to do. And don't even get me started on Ruto. I always hated having to backtrack to get her if you mess something up. Baronade is a cool boss, but it really can't save this dungeon from being a pain. D tier.
Suavemente. Bésame.
Now we're getting into the good stuff. I know I'm probably going to sound like a broken record here, but the Forest Temple is probably one of my favorite dungeons in Ocarina of Time. This dungeon does almost everything right. The whole dungeon has this air of mystery about it thanks to its abandoned manor aesthetic, which has kept people theorizing about who built it and why for nearly 30 years now. The puzzles are also really cool. I like how the main gimmick revolves around defeating the 4 Poe sisters in order to access the basement where the Phantom King of Suavemente himself is waiting. And the twisty hallway? That shit's cool. I don't know really what else I can say that hasn't already been said. The Forest Temple is peak. S tier.
No! Not into the pit! It burns!
We're back in Death Mountain with the Fire Temple. Thematically, this is another good dungeon. I really like the ancient palace vibes, and Volvagia is such a really cool boss. And I'm not gonna lie, I have a bit of a soft spot for this dungeon since it was the inspiration for one of my favorite songs, Grounded by Nate Wants to Battle. That being said, playing through this dungeon is... It's kind of a drag, especially considering the repetitive main mechanic of rescuing Gorons over and over again. It's not bad, but it's nowhere near the level of the Forest Temple. Rescuing the Gorons definitely weighs the Fire Temple down, but not too heavily. B tier. Alright, look, I know that everyone and their mother hates on the Water Temple, but like, come on man, can you blame them? Completing this dungeon is one of the most tedious and repetitive chores I've ever had to do in a Zelda game. It's a confusing maze of corridors that requires you to go back and forth, raising and lowering the water levels to go back into old rooms or access new ones. The dungeon wants you to remember these minute details about it when you backtrack, and as a person with ADHD and a terrible memory, that is asking a lot. The only, and I mean the only, thing that is keeping me from ranking this dungeon at the absolute bottom of the list is the fact that the long shot is an awesome item and that the Dark Link mini-boss is absolutely peak. Other than that, C tier.
Casual bongos.
Aw, hell yeah. The Shadow Temple is undoubtedly my favorite temple in Ocarina. This dungeon rules. I absolutely love the dark, unsettling vibes it brings to the table. The guillotines scattered around the place, the undead monsters lurking in the hallways, the spooky boat ride, the eerie music, the bongo fight. It's all just so damn good! If I had played this dungeon when I was much younger, I would have most definitely had nightmares about this dungeon for weeks, and I think that really elevates it in my opinion. I always look forward to going back to this place whenever I play Ocarina. Easy S tier.
John!
The Spirit Temple is another awesome dungeon, but for different reasons. This is the only dungeon in the game where you're required to navigate through it twice. Once as a child to retrieve the Silver Gauntlets, and a second time as an adult to retrieve the Mirror Shield and fight Twin Rova. For a game about time travel, I'm genuinely surprised that more dungeons didn't do something similar. I guess it could have gotten a bit repetitive, but for what it's worth, I think it rules here. The puzzles are also kinda tough, revolving around reflecting light with the Mirror Shield to activate switches. At least when you're an adult, that is. These are always some of my favorite puzzles in Zelda games, and you're definitely going to see that more as we go, and I rank similar dungeons with this puzzle solving mechanic. All in all, I think the Spirit Temple is really solid, but not on the same level as the Forest and Shadow Temples. So, A tier. Ganondorf is a total theater kid. Ganon's castle has never really felt like a dungeon to me, but since people count it as one, I guess I'm putting it on the list. Either way, I've never really been a fan of this dungeon for one main reason. The whole thing is very much a rehash of the adult dungeons, with you needing to enter 6 mini dungeons, for lack of a better word, that are themed around the sages in order to ascend further. This is a pattern that, unfortunately, a good number of final dungeons fall victim to, and I hate it. It prevents the dungeon from having its own unique identity. It at least tries to look unique when you start to ascend, but that doesn't help it when considering that almost every floor amounts to a mini-boss fight. With that being said though, I'm gonna give credit where credit is due. This dungeon does get some things right. I like the touch that the music that you hear while progressing through the dungeon is being played by Ganondorf the entire time, and the fight at the end? Alright, it's kinda cool. It's easily the weakest Ganondorf fight in the series, but it's iconic. Other than that, this dungeon's kinda mid. C tier.
The poison is kicking in.
Majora's Mask doesn't have much to offer in terms of dungeons, probably being the game with the least amount of them in them, excluding Breath of the Wild. That being said, I have a soft spot for some of them. The first dungeon is Woodfall Temple, and as far as first dungeons go, I think this is one of the better ones. The whole dungeon is heavily focused on utilizing the Deku Mask, essentially being a way to test what you've learned thus far. The dungeon isn't very long, nor is it difficult, but honestly, I don't mind that too much. The music, the design, and atmosphere are all just so good, I can't help but enjoy it. It's a good dungeon that serves as a solid test of your skills with the Deku Mask, but that's about it. B tier. Snowhead is one of the few ice dungeons in the series that isn't absolutely infuriating. The whole dungeon mostly revolves around using the Goron mask to roll around in a spiky ball, jump ramps, and knock stuff down in order to ascend the tower. The whole thing is honestly a really fun time, with the fight against Got, or Goat, however you want to say it, probably being the cherry on top. It's easily one of the most fun boss fights in the game, hands down. It's a solid dungeon that I think is a bit better than Woodfall, but honestly I don't have too much else to say. So, A tier.
I am under the water. Please help me.
Yet another water dungeon. Joy. I don't think Great Bay Temple is as bad as the Water Temple, but it's probably on the same level for how frustrating it can be at points. It's similar to the Water Temple in that you're manipulating how the water flows, but this time you're using the Zora Mask and the ice arrows to navigate. I definitely think that Great Bay Temple is a lot more aesthetically and atmospherically pleasing than the Water Temple, but that doesn't really mean much when it's probably my least favorite dungeon in the game. It's just another confusing mess of corridors, and Georg doesn't make it any better. He sucks. All my homies hate George. C tier.
It's upside down, isn't it?
Stone Tower Temple is without a doubt one of my absolute favorite dungeons in the series. This dungeon is absolutely peak. As this game's final dungeon, the whole thing is essentially a trial of sorts, requiring you to use all 3 of your transformation masks to solve puzzles and make progress. The main theme of the dungeon revolves around using light to solve puzzles through the use of both the mirror shield and the light arrows, which, as I said earlier, is easily one of my favorite gimmicks. It also utilizes the Elegy of Emptiness, which means we get a cameo from everyone's favorite creepypasta. But the most notable part of this dungeon is the fact that you have to flip the dungeon upside down. Suddenly, you're walking on the ceiling with the sky below you, making sure that you don't fall off. It completely changes how you navigate the dungeon, and I absolutely love playing through it every time I pick up Majora's Mask. Unquestionable S tier. Hello, kitty. Hello, kitty. Kitty in the lap? Big kitty jump. Big kitty jump. Yeah, that's a big kitty. Oh, who's a kitty? Who is the kitty? Kitty wanna help me rank Wind Waker dungeons? Yeah, Kitty wanna help me rank Wind Waker dungeons.
Grappling hook!
Next we move on to the Wind Waker and its first dungeon, Dragon Roost Cavern. This is once again a really solid first dungeon. It has some cool combat encounters, like the mini-boss fight to rescue Medley. The puzzles are all pretty interesting, and the grappling hook is a really fun item, but what I really think sells this dungeon for me is the atmosphere. If you ask me, Dragon Roost Cavern does the whole dungeon inside a volcano thing leagues better than Ocarina's Fire Temple did, and I can't help but love it for that. Solid dungeon from start to finish. A tier.
Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis.
The Forbidden Woods is the next dungeon, and once again, it's pretty solid. The aesthetics are top-notch, with the whole dungeon taking place in what seems to be an abandoned Korok or even Kokiri village. Hell, a lot of people seem to think that this dungeon actually takes place inside Kokiri Forest from Ocarina of Time, or whatever's left of it, but that's a discussion for another day. The puzzles mostly revolve around using the Deku Leaf and Boomerang to create gusts of winds and hit far-off switches. In fact, most of the puzzles revolve around the wind, which is a nice bit of foreshadowing if you ask me. Overall, I like this one quite a bit, but not as much as Dragon Roost Caverns. B tier.
Ding, 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 ding! Top of morning!
The Tower of the Gods is, once again, a really solid dungeon. I think this one might be my favorite in the game. The whole dungeon is essentially a trial for aspiring heroes, with Link needing to ascend the various floors in order to reach the top. I like the use of the command melody to move the statues around to stand on the various switches, something that kind of reminds me of Stone Tower Temple's use of the Elegy of Emptiness. The mini-boss fight against the Dark Knight is also a great introduction to these enemies that we'll be seeing a lot more of later, and I absolutely love the Godan boss fight. The cherry on top, though, is easily the top of the tower, where Link rings the bell to ask the gods to acknowledge him as a true hero. Amazing dungeon both thematically and gameplay-wise. S tier.
Slip in quietly through the crack in the door.
I'm gonna be honest, Forsaken Fortress really doesn't do it for me. The dungeon isn't bad, but it's one of those occasions where I don't really feel like it counts as a dungeon. By the rules I set up at the beginning, it absolutely does, with there being a boss at the end and it being required to progress the story, but I don't know. It may largely come down to the fact that when I think of the Forsaken Fortress, I don't think of the cool Phantom Ganon boss fight or bashing the skull of the Helmarok King in with the hammer. I think of the first run-through of the dungeon, where you're completely itemless and need to slowly sneak through the entire thing. I don't hate stealth segments in video games, but something about it here just annoys me. I think a dungeon that requires you to mostly be stealthy could work really, really well, but not here. I don't really know how else to describe my feelings on this dungeon other than C tier.
Hey there, demons. It's me, your boy.
The Earth Temple is probably my second favorite dungeon in the game, though it's a very close second. Unlike the rest of Wind Waker, the Earth Temple is very dark, eerie, and kind of unsettling. The dungeon feels pretty similar aesthetically to Ocarina's Shadow Temple, with the dungeon taking place in an underground crypt and the majority of the enemies being undead. It also borrows a lot from both the Spirit and Stone Tower temples, with the majority of the puzzles being focused on using the Mirror Shield or Medley's Harp to reflect light. These are definitely some of the best puzzles in the game, if you ask me. However, I do have to dock some points due to the dungeon kind of lacking a little in the creativity department. The whole thing really does feel like the Shadow and Spirit temples mashed together, which kinda takes away from its overall identity. Still though, it's a solid dungeon. A tier.
Fucking windy!
The Wind Temple is another personal favorite of mine. The whole thing is fairly similar to the Forbidden Woods from earlier, with many of the puzzles being focused around the use of the wind. However, the Wind Temple managed to differentiate itself from the Forbidden Woods thanks to its semi-industrial vibes. There are massive fans that Link uses to reach the higher areas in the dungeon, along with these large grated walls. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. I also love the fact that this is a hookshot dungeon, with Makar helping Link throughout the dungeon by growing little trees that he can hook onto. Also, Makar's little walk is just perfection. And of course, I have to mention that this dungeon is home to the best song in the game, as well as one of the best boss fights in the game, Mulgera. I like this dungeon, but not as much as the Earth Temple. B tier.
Ganondorf is a Tony Cedar kid.
Hey, so I have a great idea. What if we took Ganon's castle from Ocarina of Time, except we made it worse? That's Ganon's tower. A lot of my previous complaints about Ganon's castle from Ocarina show back up here. The entire dungeon is just a rehash of previous dungeons. There are 4 sections, and each one ends with a rematch against one of the dungeon bosses. In addition to lacking identity, this whole dungeon just pads the runtime of the game by at least an hour or so. However, it does have some redeeming factors. The Phantom Ganon fight and the Puppet Ganon fights are both really good, and the final boss fight against Ganon is cinematic as hell. Unfortunately, that can't save it from its placement. D tier.
Monkey.
Twilight Princess is up next, and its first dungeon is the Forest Temple. This dungeon's theming is super cool, with the whole thing being carved out of the trunks of massive trees, which isn't too different from Ocarina's Deku Tree. Throughout the dungeon, Link needs to rescue the trapped monkeys in order to face off against their leader, Ook, who's been corrupted by the fused shadow. Once Link does so, Ook actually comes to Link's aid during the boss fight against the dungeon's boss, Diababa. This is such a cool concept, and it adds to my overall enjoyment of the dungeon. I definitely think this is my favorite beginner dungeon in the series. A tier.
So we back in the mine.
The Goron Mines is a pretty straightforward dungeon. Link needs to go in, get 3 pieces of the boss key from the Goron Elders located within, and then fight the boss. I like the use of magnets throughout the dungeon, with Link needing to use the iron boots to stick to the ceiling and walk around. And, okay, yeah, guys, I'm gonna be so for real. I forgot this dungeon existed. It's really not that memorable. It's not bad, but yeah, C tier.
Water and water and water, water, water and water and water, water.
Lakebed Temple immediately gets praise from me for being a water temple that doesn't make me want to commit a war crime. While it revolves around moving water to a central room like the Water and Great Bay temples before it, I think Lakebed Temple surpasses them both thanks to its theming. The whole dungeon has these narrow corridors that make it feel super claustrophobic, and when it finally does open up, you'll immediately wish it hadn't because of this thing! Okay, I know I said I wouldn't be factoring bosses into my ranking, but like, this thing is terrifying. I need to give credit where credit is due. Also, it's the dungeon where you get the claw shot, and I'm pretty sure we know how I feel about hookshot dungeons by now. B tier. Okay, so do I really need to talk about Arbiter's Grounds? I mean, what am I gonna add to the conversation that hasn't already been said a million times before? This dungeon rules. The entire thing is a desert execution site full of undead monsters like Stalfos, Pobes, Gibdos, and the coolest mini-boss in the game, Death Sword. I know that name is edgy as fuck, but this guy looks so damn cool, and I love that the fight requires you to use your wolf senses to see him. The spinner is easily the most fun item in the entire game, and it's a crime that it isn't used as much elsewhere. And at the end of the dungeon, you're graced with one of the most fun boss fights in the entire series, Star-Lord. I mean, what else can I really say? S tier.
Why are you buying clothes at the soup store? Fuck you!
Right after Arbiter's Grounds, we're graced with yet another banger of a dungeon in the form of Snow Peak Ruins. Right off the bat, the aesthetics of this dungeon are some of the best in the series. Instead of taking place within a temple, we get to explore the ruins of an abandoned manor. This place is still one of the most mysterious locations in the series, since we have no idea who the original inhabitants were or why it was built, and I love it for that reason. Despite being an ice dungeon with admittedly obnoxious sliding block puzzles that make me want to rip my hair out, I think that everything else in the ruins makes up for it. The overall vibes, destroying guys with cannons, the mini-boss fight against Darkhammer, the soup? Dude, how can you not love this dungeon? Easy S tier.
The giant enemy spider.
The Temple of Time is yet another awesome dungeon. It's pretty similar to Wind Waker's Tower of the Gods in a number of ways, with the Dominion Rod being used to move statues around and the mini-boss being a fight against the game's first Dark Nut. Aesthetically, this dungeon is awesome. Some of the areas are well lit and look almost brand new, but then other parts are dimmer and clearly far older. It's as if a new temple was built right on top of the old one. It's such a unique vibe that only a handful of dungeons really share. Unfortunately though, that's kind of it. There really isn't a lot to talk about when it comes to the Temple of Time. The dungeon is extremely linear and kind of easy if I'm being honest. The only real dangers that I can think of are the various traps that litter the place. It does, however, have the Armagoma boss fight, and I really enjoy that one because... Spider gets smished. Solid dungeon. B tier.
I'm flying! Jack.
I have mixed feelings about the city in the sky, but I'm not really sure why, to be honest. Aesthetically, this is an amazing dungeon. It's a giant floating city being held up by massive propellers that's been long abandoned and forgotten, save for my sleep paralysis demons. Seriously, why do they have nipples? This should be a dungeon that I really like, especially since the item is a second claw shot. But I just can't like it all that much. The dungeon is just so slow. A lot of it is just waiting around for Akka or P-Hats to take you where you need to go. It just feels way longer than it actually is. The saving grace, however, is definitely the Argarok boss fight. It's a giant fuck-ass dragon that you fight using the double claw shots while a storm rages on in the background. That's pretty damn cool. Other than that, this dungeon's not it. C tier.
Hi, Shadow. It's me, the devil.
Once again, I have mixed feelings on the Palace of Twilight, though for somewhat different reasons. I'm not a massive fan of the aesthetic here. They're definitely cool, don't get me wrong. I like the eerie, almost alien vibe that they have, but other than that, the whole dungeon's just kinda mid. It all feels weirdly empty, if you know what I mean. I also feel like this dungeon goes on for way too long. It's in no way complex by any means. None of the puzzles are particularly difficult that you'll need a guide to get through, but it may come down to the fact that there's just a lot of backtracking required. You need to go through this part of the dungeon to get the ball, go back to the entrance with the ball, run through the other part of the dungeon to get the second ball, go back to the entrance with that ball, and then you can enter the middle part. And this is all assuming that you don't let the hand grab the ball and take it all the way back to the start. I do, however, kinda like how closely tied to Zant the whole dungeon is, with Link needing to fight Phantom Zant twice, dodge those creepy floating Zant heads, and run away from the massive grabby hands. And although a lot of people complain about it, I kinda like the goofiness of the Zant boss fight. Other than that, not a big fan of this dungeon. C tier.
Ganondorf is a total feeder kid.
Unlike the final dungeons in the previous games we've covered, Hyrule Castle is actually one I really enjoy. The entire thing is essentially a massive gauntlet of some of the strongest enemies in the game, with Link needing to fight his way through the castle in order to reach the throne room. There aren't a whole lot of puzzles here, but I honestly don't mind that much. I wouldn't really expect there to be a lot of puzzles inside of Hyrule Castle, if that makes sense. I like that we get to fight King Bulblin for a final time, and the final boss fight against Ganondorf is probably one of the best in the series. It's a solid dungeon, and I like that it has its own identity. But at the same time, it doesn't really have anything that really makes it a worthy competitor to something like Arbiter's Grounds. So, B tier. Skyward Sword's first dungeon is Skyview Temple, and it's a pretty solid first dungeon. In terms of aesthetics, it has the basic abandoned shrine in the woods theme, but I think that works pretty well here. The puzzles aren't too complicated, with many of them relying on the use of the beetle, a severely underrated item in my opinion. The variety of enemies here is pretty good, with the mini-boss being a cool fight against a Stalfos. The Girahim boss fight at the end is also pretty enjoyable, being a great introduction to one of the series' most memorable villains. I don't really have too much else to say here. B tier. Okay, yeah, I completely forgot about this dungeon. The Earth Temple is really basic in terms of dungeons. I mean, There's not a whole lot going on here. Link jumps across some rocks, rolls around on a ball, and fights this boring ass boss at the end. I legitimately don't know what else to say here. It's just not that good. The music is probably the one thing that I really like about it. Other than that, D tier.
As a child, I yearned for the mines.
The Lanayru mining facility is a really unique dungeon for a number of reasons. For one, the entire thing is a massive factory, a setting that we haven't really seen in a Zelda game before. This immediately nets at some points in my book. Another notable thing about the mining facility is its main mechanic. The central mechanic of the dungeon revolves around using time shift stones to create little pockets of distorted time that brings the factory back to its prime. Time shift stones are already such an interesting mechanic, so it makes me really happy to see them being utilized in a dungeon like this. Moldarak is also a pretty damn cool boss. I like its design with the eyes and its claws, and the fact that it's called the 1,000-year arachnid, meaning that this is a grown-up version of the little babies that we've been murdering throughout the dungeon. Other than that though, there's not a whole lot about the Lanayru mining facility that really stands out in my opinion. B tier.
The Bible does say love thy neighbor.
You're a Buddhist.
If you've watched any dungeon ranking video before, then you know how the community feels about the Ancient Cistern. It is, without a doubt, one of the series' best dungeons, bar none. And that's nothing to scoff at, considering that the Ancient Cistern is technically a water dungeon. The aesthetics here are off the charts, leaning heavily into its Buddhist influence, with depictions of lotus flowers and a large statue in the center. However, the undoubtedly coolest part of the dungeon, in my opinion, is the fact that it has a hidden dark side, for lack of a better word. While the upper levels are all bright and pristine, the lower levels are the complete opposite, being what is essentially the underworld. There are undead bokoblins down here that at one point try to chase after Link as he desperately tries to climb a thread to escape, a scene that's taken directly from Buddhist legend. And just when you think this dungeon couldn't get any better, it hits you with one of the absolute best bosses in this series, Kalaktos. I absolutely love this dungeon, and it unquestionably belongs in S tier.
Do what you want, cause a pirate is free. You are a pirate.
As I mentioned earlier, I really like the time shift stone mechanic that was in the Lanayru mining facility, so I was happy to see that it was brought back for our next dungeon, the Sand Ship. This is once again one of the most unique dungeons in the series, with the entire thing being on a massive derelict pirate ship that's been taken over by a bunch of robot pirates. However, Link can use the time shift stone in the ship's mast to change the entire dungeon to its prime in the long distant past. This reminds me a lot of Stone Tower Temple in the sense that you completely change how you view the dungeon in order to access new areas. The mini-boss fight against the pirate leader, Skirvo, is also one of my favorites in the game, with you essentially needing to push him closer and closer to the edge of the plank until he falls off. The build-up to the boss is also really damn good, with massive tentacles erupting from the walls and tearing apart the dungeon as you make a mad dash to the top deck. Unfortunately, that build-up is totally wasted when you see that the boss is Tantalus. That aside though, the Sand Ship is a really damn good dungeon. A tier.
Burn to the ground! Burn to burn!
The Fire Sanctuary is the second to last dungeon in the game, and it's a fairly decent one at that. To me, it feels like a lot what the Earth Temple should have been, with the puzzles being a bit more difficult. The magma mitts are a pretty cool item, allowing Link to dig underground to solve various puzzles and collect goodies. They don't get a ton of use outside of the dungeon in my opinion, but I think they're still pretty cool. The dungeon's boss is a rematch against Girahim, which is a pretty solid fight all things considered. A lot more challenging than the first fight against him in Skyview Temple. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. B tier.
I literally suck at slide puzzles. I can't do these.
Skykeep is the final dungeon Skyward Sword has to offer, and it has one of the most unique premises for a dungeon in the series. The entire dungeon is essentially a series of 8 different rooms that can be rearranged by a sliding tile puzzle. In theory, this idea is super cool, since it essentially means that everyone has a somewhat different way of solving the dungeon. Unfortunately though, Skykeep falls victim to the same trap that a majority of final dungeons have. Each room is just a rehash of previous dungeons, taking away the chance for Skykeep to have its own identity. It's a fun dungeon, but other than that, it's really nothing to write home about. C tier.
Elephant green screen effect.
While Breath of the Wild's Divine Beasts don't technically count as dungeons, I'm gonna throw them on the list anyway. Why? Because I can. I also rewrote these sections like 5 times, so yeah, they're gonna be a little more detailed than the rest of the script. I have a lot of thoughts. We'll start off with Vah Ruta, the Divine Beast of Water. On a first playthrough, this is probably the first Divine Beast that players will visit, given that Zora's domain is so close to Kakariko Village. Being the Divine Beast of Water, it only makes sense that a majority of Ruta's puzzles revolve around its respective element. Once Link gets a map of the Divine Beast, he's able to raise and lower Ruta's trunk to various angles, which sprays water into different parts of the beast. This can be used to activate switches, spin water wheels, and put out a fire at one point. On paper, that's all perfectly fine. It's incredibly easy to understand, especially if you're still getting used to Breath of the Wild. The problem lies in the fact that Ruta never really does anything interesting with this gimmick. The puzzles are ridiculously easy, pretty much being solved by just moving the trunk and seeing what happens. There's really no point where the dungeon asks you to stop and really think about what to do. Even on a first playthrough, you could probably breeze through this thing in like 20-30 minutes tops. None of this is to say that Vah Ruta is bad, it just makes it kinda bland and forgettable. Like Mipha. The ideas are serviceable and it teaches players how the Divine Beasts work, but once it's over, there's not much of a reason to think about it again. C tier.
Lizard, 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 lizard.
I don't like Vah Rudania. It is unquestionably the weakest of the 4 Divine Beasts. To its credit, Rudania starts off kinda strong. When you first enter, you're forced to navigate through complete darkness using nothing but the light of your torch. On my first playthrough, I genuinely thought the entire dungeon would lean into this idea. Limited vision, careful movement, maybe even some kind of monster lurking in the darkness. And then you get the map. The lights come on, the tension disappears, and the coolest part about the whole thing just stops. Which really makes you stop and ask, what was the point? It doesn't teach you anything, it doesn't affect the rest of the dungeon in a meaningful way, and it never comes back. It's there, and then it's gone. What's worse is that Rudania never replaces that tension with anything equally engaging, in my opinion. There's no real sense of danger other than some guardian scouts and some floating malice heads. And I know that's technically on every Divine Beast, but it only really bothers me here. The main mechanic of rotating Rudania 90 degrees at a time also just kind of feels lazy. Most of the puzzles boil down to turn lizard 90 degrees. I mean, I'm like 90% sure that at least 2 or 3 terminals are accessed just by rotating the lizard 90 degrees and not by solving any puzzles. But the most frustrating part to me is the fact that Vah Rudania had the ability to be good. A volcanic dungeon built around darkness, shifting gravity, and environmental danger should be good. But Rudania never builds on these concepts. It's not challenging, it's not particularly fun to replay, and it reminds me of myself. A disappointment. D tier. Vanaboris is definitely one of the better Divine Beasts in my opinion. In fact, it's probably one of my favorites to revisit whenever I replay Breath of the Wild. This is mostly because of the puzzles. Unlike some of the other Divine Beasts, Naboris actually has you engage with its core mechanic in a meaningful way. Most of the dungeon revolves around figuring out how to route electricity through the Divine Beast in order to do different things. Power switches, open doors, and activating elevators, all done by just completing circuits. This is mostly done by rotating the 3 massive cylinders that make up Naboris' body, and I think this is a gimmick that hasn't really been explored too much in the series. Electricity puzzles feel so few and far between in Zelda games, so to see them getting explored here is kinda refreshing. None of it is incredibly complex, but it's always engaging enough when I replay Breath of the Wild. And that's it for Vanaboris. Yep, there's nothing else to talk about. Alright, fine. So I know I said I wasn't going to be discussing the bosses, but I think I need to make an exception here. One of the biggest flaws of the Divine Beasts is the fact that all of the bosses are essentially the same. From a story perspective, this makes sense. They're all extensions of Calamity Ganon, so it makes sense that they'd all bear striking similarities. But from a gameplay perspective, this kind of ends up hurting the Divine Beast's ability to stand out from each other, as if that wasn't already hard enough for them to do. That being said, Thunderblight is the standout of the group. This fight is genuinely difficult, especially on a first playthrough. It aggressively tests your ability to perform flurry rushes, parry, and react quickly under pressure in a way that the other Blights don't. It's fast, punishing, doesn't give you much room to breathe, and I've kinda come to appreciate that over time. Overall though, Naboris is a solid experience from start to finish, but that's really about it. Nothing here is bad, but nothing here blows me away either. B tier.
Bird up.
I think Va Meadow is probably my favorite Divine Beast out of the four, though not for the reasons you think. Okay, that's a lie, but hear me out. Va Meadow immediately stands out from the other Divine Beasts for the simple reason that it can fly. It embraces the idea of movement through an open space, especially during the assault with Teba. Once Link acquires the map, Meadow doesn't just let you rotate a single section like Ruta or Naboris. The entire dungeon can roll to predetermined angles, fundamentally changing how you move through this dungeon. The freedom of movement also strongly affects the puzzles inside it. They're all built around wind currents, momentum, and physics. You tilt the dungeon to guide a ball to hit a button, using wind currents to open gates, and relying on gravity to reach new areas. There's also just something to be said about how enjoyable Meadow is to replay, at least for me. It's in no way the most complex Divine Beast, and it definitely doesn't push you too hard, but to me, it's still really enjoyable. It's by no means an S tier, but it's still a damn good time. Also, it's Rivali's dungeon, so A tier. The final trial was probably the biggest and most welcome surprise of the Champion's Ballad DLC. It's what I would call the first real dungeon of the Wild era, and for what it's trying to be, I think it succeeds. The dungeon is essentially divided into 4 chambers, each one containing a puzzle that relates to one of the Divine Beasts. By completing a puzzle, you remove one part of the lock on the final door. It's a simple setup, but it's effective. It feels like the game is truly building up to something. Mechanically, most of the puzzles revolve around manipulating the central axle and changing the direction it rotates. The puzzles themselves, while all pretty easy, still made me use my head a couple of times. Aesthetically and mechanically, the final trial is still very much a Divine Beast, but it's the one that feels a bit more focused and better paced than the other ones. And honestly, I love this dungeon. It is easily one of my favorite parts of replaying Breath of the Wild. That said, there are some things I can't ignore. Namely the fact that it still looks like everything else in the game. Seriously, is it that hard to make something not look Sheikah related? The Monk Maz Koshia fight, while easily the best fight in Breath of the Wild and one of the best in the series, does a lot of heavy lifting for the dungeon overall. The final trial is a good step forward, but it's not the full realization just yet. B tier.
The seals took over the Guardians! Who saw that shit coming?
From what I've heard, a lot of people don't count Hyrule Castle as a dungeon. To those people, I'd like to point out that Hyrule Castle has a 3D map just like all the other Divine Beasts. Therefore, dungeon. With that out of the way, I absolutely love Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle. I know that as a dungeon, it's really not that good. There are virtually no puzzles, and the ones that there are can hardly be classified as puzzles. But to me, that's not what this dungeon is about. If anything, it's about the atmosphere. Hyrule Castle is meant to be a symbol of the royal family's power, and by extension, the strength of Hyrule itself. So to see it completely consumed by malice, overrun by guardians, and crawling with the strongest monsters in the game really shows you how devastating the Great Calamity was. While you can just walk up the main path and get straight to the Sanctum, you'll have to avoid the numerous guardians that are shooting lasers at you. But if you go through the different parts of the castle, you'll be constantly fighting various different enemies, like the Lionels and the gatehouses. The castle is overall incredibly non-linear, and it really makes you feel like an unwanted presence in a hostile space, if that makes sense. And the music. The music! I know I haven't touched on dungeon themes before this, but I'm making an exception here because, oh my god, this fucking slaps. The only real downside that I can think of is that the spider in the basement is kind of a mid-ass fight. For the manifestation of the calamity that brought Hyrule to its knees, it's way too easy. But even with that, Hyrule Castle succeeds at what it sets out to do. It's immersive, memorable, and easily the strongest example of environmental storytelling in the game. That said, I just can't bring myself to put it in S tier. As much as I love it, it doesn't feel right to say that it stands shoulder to shoulder with Arbiter's Grounds or Stone Tower Temple. So instead, I'm placing it just below that. A tier.
What's this icky paint-like goop?
The Water Temple, aka the Great Wellspring of Hyrule, is... okay, I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it. It sucks. This is by far my absolute least favorite water temple in any Zelda game. Not because it's frustrating or confusing, but because it's just so aggressively bland. If I'm being real, most of this dungeon doesn't even feel like it has anything to do with water. Oh sure, there are giant faucets and pools of water, but when compared to previous water dungeons, that kind of feels like the absolute bare minimum. And let me ask you a question. Why exactly is this dungeon in the sky? Wouldn't it have made more sense to put it on the surface, or even better, the depths, like an actual wellspring? I feel like it was just put up here for the sake of having 2 dungeons on each map, and because of the low gravity mechanics, which I'll touch on in a second. Sidon's ability also feels kind of useless here. Outside of the handful of moments where it's required, it just feels largely unnecessary. It pretty much amounts to a slower way to clear the muck, something that you can do far more efficiently with a hydrant or even splash fruit if you have a bunch of them. I'm genuinely not sure if I'm missing something here, but this whole thing just feels dumb. I'll give the dungeon some credit, however. I like the idea of combining the bubbles and low gravity to reach new areas and bypass some obstacles. It's unique, creative, and I particularly enjoyed it on my first playthrough. But even then, it kind of feels like the bubbles were added to further justify calling this a water temple. There's nothing here that's specifically bad, it's just painfully forgettable. The puzzles are simple, the theming feels weak, and the entire thing amounts to Mukta Rock. This is the Varudanya of Tears of the Kingdom. D tier.
This is an advanced skateboarding trick.
Yeah, it's called digging up Atlantis.
The Fire Temple, aka the Lost City of Garandia, is another dungeon that kind of disappoints me, though to a lesser extent. Aesthetically speaking, this dungeon is so cool. An entire ancient city hidden within the depths beneath Death Mountain is such a cool idea, and it absolutely nails the vibe. The scale is impressive, the atmosphere feels oppressive, and the way it's presented make it feel like the ruins of something important, if that makes sense. I also like the idea of using minecarts to navigate between the different parts of the dungeon. In theory, this dungeon should be really damn cool. A multi-layered dungeon built around rail systems, switches, and routing paths sounds like something you would find in a traditional Zelda dungeon. The problem lies in the fact that a lot of the dungeon's mechanics feel misguided. While it's a cool idea, using the minecarts to get around feels needlessly complicated at points. And what's worse is that the game's own mechanics make this system kind of unnecessary, since you can just climb the walls or use Ascend. Half the time, it's far easier for you to just brute force your way through instead of doing the dungeon the way it's intended. Yunobo also kind of suffers from the same issue that Sidon did in the Water Temple, but to a lesser extent. Excluding the Marbled Goma fight, his ability mostly amounts to deactivating the locks or hitting a switch or two, and that's pretty much it. It's kind of a shame considering how useful Yunobo's ability is in other parts of the game, like destroying the rock walls and caves. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the Fire Temple. It's not bad by any means, but it feels like it was designed without accounting for the abilities given to the player. Compared to the Water Temple, this is definitely an improvement. There's a stronger aesthetic, some clever ideas, and multiple points where it almost hits the mark, but it just needed a little bit more refinement. C tier.
It's all over the news. Some fella just stole a pyramid.
The Lightning Temple is definitely one of the better dungeons in the game, mainly because I would actually consider it to be a dungeon. Of all the dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom, this is the one that I say feels the most like a traditional dungeon from start to finish. One of its biggest strengths, in my opinion, is the fact that it utilizes the classic reflection puzzles from dungeons like the Spirit Temple and Stone Tower Temple. Granted, you don't get a mirror shield, but you can glue a mirror to your shield, so it's kinda like one. The puzzles aren't that challenging, all things considered, but there's something about finding that sweet spot so a mirror reflects the light how you want it to that's incredibly satisfying. It also feels like one of the larger dungeons in the game, aside from the Fire Temple, that is. The atmosphere and aesthetic do a lot of heavy lifting here, and I like how the main goal is to power the elevator so you and Riju can reach the top and fight Queen Gibdo. That's another element I really like about the Lightning Temple. Queen Gibdo being introduced and having a short fight before you even enter the dungeon is such a cool idea, and it makes the actual boss fight later on feel a bit more earned in my opinion. My only real complaint is that Riju feels a bit underutilized in the puzzles, but at this point that's pretty much par for the course with these dungeons. It would have been nice to see more electricity-based puzzles like in Va Naboris, but at the same time, I'm not that torn up about it. Other than that, I think the Lightning Temple is a well-designed dungeon. It's not perfect, but it's a good time from start to finish. A tier.
I'm back in the fucking building again!
Okay, full disclosure. I'm recording this part halfway through editing because I legitimately didn't think Hyrule Castle counted as a dungeon. But by my own established logic, if you get a heart container at the end, it counts. So I'm redoing the script again. Joy. This version of Hyrule Castle is pretty much the exact opposite of what made it work in Breath of the Wild. I won't unpack everything since you literally just heard me talk about it a few minutes ago, but in Breath of the Wild, the castle felt oppressive and hostile. It was a gauntlet of powerful enemies that you had to fight through in order to reach the sanctum. Even without traditional puzzles, the castle itself was the challenge. In Tears of the Kingdom, you just kind of walk up there. There's no real resistance or tension, and the only obstacle really is just getting up there, which is not that hard to do, all things considered. Sure, you have to fight the enemies that Zelda summons, but they're just a bunch of standard monsters that you probably killed hundreds of at this point. This whole part is just a wild goose chase, sending you from point A to point B multiple times until you're finally told to go to the sanctum. And sure, the Phantom Ganon fight is pretty damn cool. Fighting multiple of them at once is a decent challenge, but at this point in the game, you probably fought dozens of them already. It's all just padding before the story points you to the next part. Hyrule Castle in Tears of the Kingdom is the opposite of what it was in Breath of the Wild. It's not memorable, it's not challenging, and it doesn't even deserve to be called a dungeon. But by my own rules, I have to rank it. And by those same rules, D tier.
Let's get ready to rumble!
The tricky part about ranking the Spirit Temple is deciding exactly what counts as the Spirit Temple. While I could just say that the actual building in the depths called the Spirit Temple is the only part that counts, I feel like it makes more sense to include the Construct Factory in the overall ranking. So that's what I'm gonna do. Conceptually, I like this dungeon a lot. You're tasked with solving small puzzles across the different depots of the Construct Factory, gradually collecting and assembling different parts of a new construct for Mineru's spirit to inhabit. Like all the other puzzles in the game, nothing here is very challenging, but I will admit that it does a good job of making the player feel like they're building towards something tangible instead of just activating terminals for the 5th time. Once the construct is completed, you're able to ride it across the gloom and make it to the Spirit Temple proper, where you fight the seized construct in what is basically a cage match to the death. Honestly, This is pretty damn cool. It's such a weird, unique boss that stands out from all the others, and yeah, it's solid. All of this together is pretty cool in my opinion, but it raises a decent question. Why are the Construct Factory and the Spirit Temple even separate locations to begin with? Why wasn't the Construct Factory just housed within the Spirit Temple? The only real explanation that I can think of is so the game will force you to use Minoru to physically reach the temple. While this does technically work, it makes the whole thing feel more fragmented than it needs to be. Instead of one cohesive experience, it feels like two completely separate ideas that got stuck together. And that's kind of the Spirit Temple's biggest flaw in my opinion. The concept is strong, but the execution falls flat. I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. It's creative, different, and decently memorable. It just needed more time in the oven. C tier.
Let me blow you away.
Yeah, there's a reason I saved this one for last. In my opinion, the Wind Temple, aka the legendary Stormwind Arc, is unarguably Tears of the Kingdom's best dungeon. And also, I just wanted to end on a high note. If I'm being honest, I think that the Wind Temple truly begins before you ever set foot on it. In my opinion, it truly begins with the ascent. I'll explain why in a minute. Everything about this is absolutely peak. The atmosphere is incredible, with the storm raging as you and Tulin navigate up the small chain of islands and debris. The music starts slowly and quietly, but it ascends alongside you, creating this perfect sense of anticipation. And then when you finally reach the highest point of the storm, the music just cuts out entirely, only to swell back in as you dive straight into the eye of the storm where the Stormwind Arc awaits. This moment alone does more for the Wind Temple than most other dungeons manage in their entirety. It's dramatic, memorable, and it instantly makes the Wind Temple feel important. The dungeon itself, I'll admit, doesn't quite reach the same level as the Ascent, but it's still such an enjoyable experience. The puzzles aren't exactly challenging or ambitious, but they're consistently engaging in my opinion. I really like some of the smaller touches here, like having to use Ultra Hand to create a lever or using an icicle to make an axle. They're not much, but I think they're neat. Tulin suffers from the same problem that the other sages do, being a bit underutilized in the Wind Temple's puzzles, but I think he gets a pass here because of the Ascent. Because he accompanies and assists you during your climb to the dungeon, Tulin feels genuinely connected to the Wind Temple, since he actively discovers it alongside you. This is probably the biggest reason I associate the Ascent with the Wind Temple, and if you have a problem with that, then go cry about it, bitch. Okay, that was mean, I'm sorry. And while Yunobo kind of gets the same treatment, with there being a whole boss battle and him diving into Death Mountain with you, it kind of feels like it's to a lesser extent. And then there's Colgera. Again, I know I said I wasn't going to factor bosses into the ranking, but come on, man, it's fucking Colgera! It's such a cool touch that you're able to see it lurking beneath the lock with the secret stone, just waiting for when you finally free it. And the fight itself? Cinema. I don't care if it's on the easier side. There's something inherently awesome about battling a giant flying monster in a storm while free falling through the sky and diving into its weak points. If you ask me, the Wind Temple managed to defy all expectations and then some, creating quite possibly one of the best experiences we've ever had in the series. It has easily cemented itself as one of my favorite dungeons of all time. No hesitation. S tier. And with that, our tier list is complete. Every single 3D Zelda dungeon ranked from S tier to D tier. Like I said at the beginning, this whole list is purely based on my personal opinion and experiences with these dungeons, and my opinion is the only one that matters here, so suck it, losers! In all seriousness though, let me know what you agree and disagree with me on down in the comments. And if you want to make a tier list of your own, I linked the tier list I used in the description. When you're done, you should share it with me and others in the community section of my channel, because that's a thing you can do. Anyway, I think it's time we wrapped this video up. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, then please leave a like and subscribe. It's free, and you can unsubscribe later if you hate my guts. Until then, I've been Linked Wolf, and I'll see you next time. Hey, so I'm just adding this at the end because I want it to be an hour long. Yeah. Okay, bye.